Okay, and good morning to everyone. We are part of the Creative Academy, and this is Eileen Cook, and this is our office hours for Tuesday, November 6th. So we have two things to go over today. We're actually going to do a blue pencil on Jen's short story. So whoop whoop to Jen, who submitted that. So thank you for that. And we're also going to chat a little bit about everyone's NaNo project and hear how that is going. And then also tackle any questions, problems, various things as you're working along, some of which might be connected to NaNo, I don't know. So are there any questions before we dive in? That looks like a no. I wonder, yes, or it's a totally silent moment. I wonder, Jen, can you turn on your mic and tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write this short story? I personally have a hunch, but I'm curious to hear if I'm right. Oh, your mic's not on, Jen. Hang on. We can't have you being silent, then it's no fun. Try now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We sure can.
Okay. I guess the idea of the story just came about. It's kind of like a fable almost about what it's like to be a victim in this world, and it's taken through the eyes of a zebra who was attacked by a lion, but it's a euphemism for women being attacked by men.
It had a very Brent Kavanaugh kind of feel to me, for those of us who watched the Brent Kavanaugh hearings and sort of felt like our blood boil a little bit. So I'm going to dive into these pages, and Jen, you don't have to make mad crazy notes because I actually will send it back to you with the notes written on it. So that should hopefully make your life just a tiny little bit easier. And we'll go from there. So for other people, it's a very short story. I think it's under 1,000 words. And it reads very much to me like an Aesop's fable. And in fact, it is in fact using animals in the same way that Aesop did to sort of highlight and deal with human behaviors. So the story opens that the lion and zebra meet by chance at the pond. It had been years since their last meeting. I like this line. To the lion, it had been of little consequence, but to the zebra, it had meant everything. So I think that's a very just sort of intriguing opening, and I think it works really well to sort of also set up the subtext of what's happening. So even in just those two lines, I started to have a little bit of some thoughts. So some things that you'll see as you go along is in certain places, I suggested that you move things to contractions. So instead of it is something that he is not going to respond, it would be isn't is my thing. And people who have been stuck doing edits with me before know that I get this from a very particular place, which is I read a book called The Blockbuster Code, I think was the name of it. And 99.9% of it I did not like. But the part that I did like actually dealt with sort of like various things that will kind of pull people along. And this is less of an issue in a short story like this as it would be in a bigger piece, but I want to sort of bring it up and highlight it for people, is that contractions actually, one, they're more similar to how we actually speak. So to people's ear, it sounds correct. And then secondly, which was why it was in this particular book, is that contractions obviously shorten things up. So it makes it the pacing faster. So it gives people the illusion and the feeling that they're turning pages more quickly. Having said that, though I suggested the change to Jen, I think some ways you'll want to think about it because this almost reads more like a more formal piece, in which case you may not want to have the contraction. So you may want to keep it just that little bit more formal. There were some lovely descriptions. So for example, the zebra stamps her delicate hoof, which is how I like to feel about my own feet when winter comes to an end, that it's still a delicate hoof, but I'm not so sure about that. And then this was a line that I really liked because I think it's a good example of using a new description that somehow still catches someone's attention, even though it may not be something that they know. So the line is, the lion, in fact, says like, oh, come on, it wasn't so bad. And zebra's frozen in place. She'd spent the years between then and now trying to push that fateful night from her mind, trying to forget the feel of his claws down her back, his lion's breath in her ear, the smell of his frothy pelt. And I thought that was interesting because I actually have zero idea of what a lion's pelt would smell like. But somehow that gave me that sense of that sort of gaminess to it that I thought worked kind of particularly well. Now, the only thing I wasn't sure about is I'm assuming that in this piece, the lion has physically attacked her with the idea he was going to snack on her. Versus obviously what it's a stand-in representation for, unless there's sort of a cross-species thing happening, in which case, hey, you do you. I'm fine with that. But because he has the line, he says, oh, come on now, it wasn't so bad, was it? That was the only line that threw me, because that was the only line that didn't make sense if he was in fact intending to eat her. And I get what you're going with it, but just something like, I think there would be another way to kind of maybe play with what he's saying that doesn't say it wasn't so bad, because he would know like his intent had been to kill her, again, versus the piggish guy who is saying like, oh, come on, baby, it wasn't so bad, when it probably in fact was. One thing I think that you do really well, particularly given how small and tight that this piece is emotion. So for example, the lioness, again, trying to talk to her, that's not a big deal. So he's saying, basically this happens all the time, right? Like zebras in your herd, they must get taken all the time, right? And she says, you didn't attack anyone else in my herd, you attacked me. And he gestures with his paw, and this line just kind of broke my heart slightly. It says, you meant nothing special to me, just another zebra. And I thought that line worked particularly well for, again, both things that you're trying to hit. So the idea of this kind of being a stand-in for a sexual assault, but then also the stand-in for the animal world, in particular because, as someone who used to cry when watching all those animal shows with my parents as a small kid, and my parents would say, like, it's just the animal kingdom, like, if a lion doesn't attack, he doesn't eat. So it kind of worked on both of those levels. And so for that reason, I thought that it was quite nice and also heartbreaking. And then there's her response. Zebra snorts, warning him to stay back, contemplating his words. All this time, she had admonished herself for having done something that had caused her to be singled out of the herd, for somehow calling attention to herself, making herself more desirable to lion's ravenous nature. Hearing that nothing had set her apart from the other zebras confuses her. What protection could she take against a lion's hunger if she was nothing more than a random prey amidst the fray? So one, prey and fray works really nicely together. But again, I think you're hitting also that kind of secondary back and forth. This is also where I just made myself a note. In general, kind of the idea of using animals or using kind of an analogy to sort of make a point is a very common thing, and it works, I think, particularly well. And I think in this piece, it's just coming across really well. So the zebra ends up standing up for herself, which I quite like. Lion's not necessarily moved necessarily, but he's getting over it. And there's a line where he says, well, until we meet again, he says over his shoulder, slinking back towards the watering hole, his tail raised high, the tuft at the end waving at her victoriously. Like, I just thought that was a lovely little snotty moment. So two things that I wanted to sort of flag or to think about is at the very start of the story, they're meeting by chance. And I wonder if it might be a little bit stronger if she goes to the watering hole with the intention of finally raising her voice. Like that maybe I think that's totally an author's choice, but that's something to think about, because I think the end of it is she's feeling good. So she's returning back to her herd and she's talking about it. And she talks about sort of feeling the cleansing power of her own voice. So I think in some ways, had she gone there with the intention to do that, I think that works kind of well. One thing that I'm flagging more for other people than for you, because I think it works in this piece, is in general, present tense, which is what this story is in, can drive people slightly crazy over a longer period of time. So it's why you won't see a lot of novels necessarily in present tense, because it has an urgency to it. You almost feel like you're stumbling forward, like you're on those like airport walkways and you're going to lose your pace at some point. So I think it actually works pretty darn well in this because it's a very short piece. And again, it's a very different form. It's much more of a fable than it is kind of a traditional short story. There was a couple tiny little tweaks that I made just to tighten things, but on the whole, this piece is really sharp and in good shape. Nice balance of kind of narrative and dialogue as they go back and forth. So that works really well. And again, I think it's certainly very timely. And I think it would be sort of interesting to redo some of the Aesop fables, given our current political climate. I think it's kind of an interesting thing to play with. I'd never thought of it. And as I was reading it, I thought it was an interesting spin that I had not seen. So I think it's a fresh take. Are you planning to send it out? What's your next steps, Jen?
Yeah, so the first swath of this, I had sent it in and it long listed with a critique back. So I have obviously fixed it because the critique really helped. And so I am thinking of resending it to, there's Writer's Digest has a short story thing. I know it's a high, like it's like one of the top things to get, but I think that's where I wanted to go, especially with, it's an American company and the Kavanaugh case was an American. So.
Well, and here's my kick at that is why not start high? Because you might get it, right? And if you don't, you won't. I can guarantee that won't happen. So I'm a big believer, like I sometimes will hear people say, oh, you shouldn't go with a US publisher because it's going to be that much harder to get in. Go with a smaller boutique publisher. And if you want to go with a smaller boutique publisher because you're looking to work with a smaller publisher, then that's what you should do. But if you want to be with one of the large big houses, or if you want to try for Writer's Digest or any of those places, then that's where you should start. And in fact, I used to get, do people know, hang on, I'm blanking on the title. It's put out by Writer's Digest. It is The Writer's Market.
Yeah.
I just had to think about it for a minute. But you can do it either online. Of course, now they have fancy digital versions, but they used to only have a paper version. And for people who haven't seen it before, it's basically almost like a phone book of markets. So you can search either like, I have a short story, where could I send it? Or you can search by various different markets. So it's kind of cross-referenced in different places. But it'll tell you kind of what they're taking, what they look for, any requirements that they have in terms of like, it must not be this or it must not be that. So it has all of that. But it also tells you how much they pay. And for me, when I was looking at short pieces, one of the things that I would do is I was like, well, if I can get $150 for this short story versus $10 or versus, one free copy of the magazine, then I'm going to go for the $150. And what's interesting is it didn't always work, but there's nothing to then stop you from submitting as you go down. So the only thing is sometimes if there's a time limit on stuff. So I don't know when the Writer's Digest contest is. So if it's not for 6 or 7 months, if you want to wait, but that just becomes the only issue around that. Go ahead.
It's November 15th.
Destiny. And then the election's today too. So they will be happy to have that, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I am a big believer. And then I'm sure it tells you somewhere in the contest when you'll hear.
And then it actually lists like your name, even if you're like 200th, you still get something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's, why not aim high? And then if you end up changing your mind or you want to send it someplace else, you can always do that. And that's, if you listen on, there's the recorded session between Mary Robinette Coal and myself. We talk about short stories. And she talks about, and I will screw this up, but she sort of says, there's sort of 3 different things that she looks at when she's submitting a story. One of them is money. One of them is prestige. And one of them is, I think she calls it something like the sparkle factor. So it's something that's important to her. And she talks about very rarely do you get all of those things. So she gave the example of there was a magazine that was the first place to ever buy one of her short stories, and they were sadly going out of business. And so she decided she had a new short story that she wanted to send it to them so it would be in their last issue. Because for her, that felt like kind of a full circle kind of moment. And that mattered more than the fact that, you know, she was going to get $10 for the story. What mattered was that she wanted to be, the sparkle factor mattered. Sometimes it's a case of prestige. So there's something where you want to be in a particular magazine or contest because if you win, you get to say, I was the winner of this, or I was a finalist in this, and it has some cachet versus I was, you know, the finalist in the Eileen Cook, no one ever heard of it award series, where someone's never going to have any idea what that means or any of those kinds of things. Whereas again, Writer's Digest is going to be something, if you had that in a query letter, I was, you know, long listed or a finalist or a winner, let's go big, right? Then that gives you that kind of little extra oomph. Leslie, you had a Writer's Digest piece.
Yeah, I unmuted myself because and that story sounds absolutely amazing. And the very first year I started writing, I submitted something and I got 8th in something. I can't remember what category it was. And so every year I've submitted something just like, oh, what the heck. And I placed every year. And last year I actually won first in a genre. And not, look, I didn't think the story is amazing. I think your story is amazing. So I think you absolutely need to do this. Do this.
I was like, I have the vaguest sense that Leslie's actually won that darn thing at some point. Which is why you always have to make sure you mention things in the celebrate corner. So otherwise we don't know. But I think that's a big vote for a yes. And again, you guys are always welcome. If you're looking for feedback from other people, we have the swap your skills section in the GLIP Academy. So if you're like, hey, I've got a really short story, would love to get another eye on it. Or in the short story team, sort of saying, hey guys, I have a short story that I'm going to be submitting. Would love to get another eye on it. Because I'm a huge believer, and you guys know that getting feedback is exactly how we make this stuff better. And different people are going to hit on different things. Strangely enough, we were recording, and I won't give it all away, but we were recording a blue pencil session yesterday with Crystal, Donna, and I. And there's a line where tragically a horse dies. Spoiler alert, a horse dies. And there's a very sad line where the character talks about, I am going to bury you with this other person. And it's this and Donna was like, you know, I cried, I had this moment. And I got totally stuck on the fact, like, how do you bury a horse? Like I actually checked with a horse friend of mine. And she's like, yeah, no, they're about 1,500 pounds, right? And I'm like, there's no way a teen girl is like gonna make a hole and bury a 15-pound animal. So like, and everyone was like, I can't believe that's bothering you. And I'm like, it's a beautiful moment, but you can't move the horse. No way she's moving that horse. So that's the kind of example of what won't bother someone and may really resonate, may for you, another reader, bump quite significantly on it, whether that's something that they know or it's just something that for them is a bounce point. The important thing to realize with that is that's totally fine. You as the author then get to make the choice. So for example, Jen, the one line where I flagged where I was like, I just don't know where he says basically it's not so bad. And that for me was just the only line where it pulled me out where he was acting like a lion being a lion. You may in the end decide like, I really want that line because of the resonance dealing with sexual assault, and the fact that it bothers Eileen bothers me not at all. And that's totally fine. That is sometimes the benefit of getting a lot of feedback, because you start finding out whether or not stuff bothers other people. My rule of thumb when I have people read stuff is I'm usually getting 3 or 4 early readers. If one person bumps on something and I love it, I get to keep it. If 2 people bump on something, I need to seriously look at that, because at least basically at that point, 50% of my readership had a problem. If 3 or altogether 4 of them bump on it, then it's not working. And it doesn't matter how much I love it. I've got to figure out, like, I might still be able to keep it in some way, shape, or form. but in some other way, it's going to have to go because it's simply not working. So that is my thing. And that's why I think it can be really valuable sometimes to get more than one person's point of view on something, because we all have our personal, pros and cons. I think some people might remember there was one year at the Surrey conference where they do that Surrey Idol, where someone used the word moist in the opening paragraph. And one agent indicated that they were out, which is what they did. I'm out. And everyone was like, wait, what? And she's like, I can't, that word just gives me ugh. And you could see all the writers in this room suddenly panicking, okay, is there a list of words that agents don't like? Who else is anti-moist? Who else hates that word? And I think other agent, whether there or in another conversation, talked about, and I'm screwing up the name because I can't remember it, but the first guy who broke her heart and dumped her was named Kevin. So if there's ever a character named Kevin, she's just out. And again, I could hear writers everywhere being like, I changed the name. I wasn't wedded to Kevin. I just picked Kevin randomly by chance. So there's some degree where there is just so much subjectivity. So feeling free to be I choose to ignore that feedback, or it bothered you. And actually that was my intent. Sometimes what we're trying to do is to jar the reader or to make them uncomfortable. Feedback that I always listen to is if someone has something where I can't physically see what you're talking about. So I was reading a piece recently where a person was writing about a fight scene. And it was I put my arm around here, I spun here, I did this, and all of a sudden I was way slowed down trying to figure out, where are we? And wait, now he's facing up, but if he was turned, and again, I was almost had stopped the whole piece and was setting out my rock and my, ink bottle and being okay, now if he's here and she's here and they spin, then he would, and if you're doing that to the reader, they're not going to keep reading, right? I'll keep reading because I've been asked to read that page, right? Not for feedback. But if I'm reading for pleasure and there's too much of that, I either skim. So if it's the only time that it's happened, I'll just sort of skim along and be happy to let that go. But if it is a piece that I'm bumping on a couple of times and I'm reading it for pleasure, then I just put it down. So that is another piece of feedback. If I'm getting the physically not working in space, that I do it. So any other questions, Jen?
I guess mainly I just wanted to make sure I wasn't too preachy.
Nope.
And that I didn't give too many humanesque qualities, but that one statement about what he said, that really helped. I think I kind of know how to fix it maybe a little bit. And then I didn't leave the zebra's point of view because I have a bad habit of doing that, especially in third person.
I will double check before I send it back to you. I did not notice that.
Okay.
I felt like we stayed in zebra's POV, but I will do one more check through as I go along.
The first paragraph is the only one that did, because it mentions, but it's just the opening one, that it didn't mean anything to him.
Yeah.
And everything to her, and then we go into her. So I thought that might be okay, that one paragraph.
I think it's okay because it's also not clear to me if that is zebra's perspective.
Okay.
Right. To lie in it had meant nothing.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Right. Because I think that's a little bit of a thing. I mean, it's preachier than I would make a lot of short stories if these were human characters. But the fact that it's got that Aesop fable, I think you have to be fairly on the nose. Otherwise, you run the risk of people thinking it's an animal story. I think it needs to be clear that I am using these animals as stand-ins for humans to make a point. And the whole point is to make a point. So you want to make sure that that's particularly clear.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. So that is a reminder for people that we do blue pencils in here. If you have some pages you would like us to look over or a query letter, we're always happy to do that. And if you want 3 eyes on it, we also do that in the blue pencil with Crystal, Donna, and myself. So that is an option for people. So happy to do that. Vig, how are you? Do you have a question or are you just wandering?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm trying to find good light. I'm in my kitchen doing things as I'm listening. Fabulous story, yeah, Jen. I love that story. Would love to read it.
Thank you.
Oh,
That
the big
relates.
lock. There you go.
Yeah.
You locked up for a second. Yeah, so you were just frozen, but now I can hear you.
Okay, so the question is, you said writing a novel in present tense, it's too intense, it goes too fast, you get that kind of airport feeling. Can you do it so that you have some of it in present tense and some of it in past tense?
I never say never, because, and I should say, even with a novel, there are novels in present tense that work incredibly well. I just think you're setting yourself up to make it more difficult. So that's probably where I would, so for clarity, you certainly, you can do anything you want. It's your story. But in general, keeping an entire novel in present tense can get really intense.
Yes,
it can also be hard to do around, because everything is happening at that moment. Right? So it's very hard to kind of stay constantly in that same moment, where versus if you're in past, there's just a little bit of breathing space to kind of go back and forth a little bit in a different way. I'm trying to think if I've seen a book that goes between present and past, and I'm not thinking of one.
So my story at the moment is present tense with the not flashback, but the remembering. So the memories are coming in as she is doing X, Y, and Z. So
you can do that. Memories would be a different thing. They can do that. I would take like one page and write it in past tense.
Yeah.
One or two, let's be honest. When I say one, I'm lying. Take a couple pages. I just wanted it to sound easier than it was going to be. Like just one page. Take 2 or 3 pages, write them in past tense, and then I would be interested to get other people's feedback about which one is working better for them. Okay. Scott has a thought.
Well, no, I have a question. Don't have too many thoughts. For like, I was told through our writing course that doing YA, it's generally present tense.
I would actually disagree.
Okay.
I would say there's more present tense. It's definitely first person is extremely common in YA. So that would be one where that's definitely common. I would say you do see more present tense in YA. But even there, I think all of mine are past.
Okay.
So it's all about me, of course. So all of mine are past tense, so clearly they all must be. But I would say quite a few of them are in that past tense.
Yeah. And so...
Go ahead.
Yeah, that you just reminded me about something that author said when around this topic is considering who's telling the story. Like it could be first person, but it could be as the adult years later telling people, and that's the context you want to give, or it could be first person, but you want everybody to live the experiences at the same time, so making it present tense. So that was what you just said just reminded me, but at the time I recalled too, also thinking that's an interesting way to look at it, as somebody around the campfire telling the story type of thing.
Yeah. And I think the thing with YA is that even if you're using past tense, you want to make sure that you're not leaning into what you just talked about, where it's, I'm now an adult telling you a story about when I was a teen. Because if there's anything that teens are generally not interested in, it's adults telling them what they should do based on what it was like when they were a teen. So it reads past tense, but it's still very immediate. You know, it's not this thing of like, you know, when I was a kid, we walked to school uphill both ways. And
we did.
And we did it through snow and we liked it. And that kind of thing will definitely put off a teen reader. So there is an immediacy even in past tense. But it is just, I think, sometimes a little bit easier to read. And it's one of those odd things. I think point of view and, you know, which tense you're in is one of those things that just drops away to the background when you're reading, if it's done well. And it's when it's not done well is when you notice it and you're like, what's wrong? Something's not working for me. And that's when you sometimes will notice that there's, you know, head hopping, so changing around points of view, or the tense just reads differently. So sometimes doing that thing where you take a smaller piece of the pie and you play with it in a different perspective. the number of times I have started a book in third person just to switch it to first is legion. So I sort of almost, I think, conceptualize of the idea in third person, but then as I start telling it, I feel like the story works better in first. And conversely, I know a lot of people who write in first because that lets them really be in the character's head. And then they end up switching it to third because they want to be able to see things that perhaps the character is not seeing, or they want to make word choices that you wouldn't necessarily see or hear from someone outside of that point of view. So that will be a thought process there. Other thoughts? All right, well, I wanted to share with people, I read a book recently. It's called Writing 5,000 Words in an Hour. Yeah, Kristen has the same face I did when I saw it, where I was like, holy. So I read it just because one, NaNo is coming along, and two, one of the things that I've been thinking about is trying to pick up my word speed. And so I would suggest for people, it's not an expensive book. I think it's $4. It's very small. Even calling it a book, I think, is a little bit generous. I think it's a very long article that he has indie published into a book. But it did have several interesting ideas. So certainly one of the biggest ones is, strangely enough, what we're very good at here is doing writing sprints. So he talked about, and in fact, he talked about starting with 5-minute writing sprints, where you're turning everything off, writing for 5 minutes, and then tracking that and seeing if you can start getting faster, and then increasing to 10 to 20 and so forth. And he talked about, probably trying to do for an hour is going to be too much. Some of them are things which you may already be doing, but it's a good reminder, which is if you are trying to write, turning off your email program so you're not getting beeps, turning off glip. Anyone else finding out that it's just like that little clunk thunk then sound it makes, where I'm like, ooh, message. And I click over to that. As human beings, we think we can multitask, and we have sort of been sold this bill of goods that really good people are great multitaskers. But the brain research shows us that's in fact not actually true. When you divide your attention, it takes your brain a second to kind of get back to the original thing. So if you're gonna try and pound out and really get some words done, sitting and doing a sprint, whether it's one of the ones that's happening here or just setting up your own sprint, also works really well. It's also very similar. There's another program that talks about working in 30-minute blocks. So, and that's actually designed for business people. It's not designed around writers, but it's the idea that if I'm going to work on this project, I'm going to do it for 30 minutes. And then they actually suggest setting an alarm, and the alarm goes off. And at that time you check your email, you get up, you go to the bathroom, you make your cup of tea, and then you sit back down, you set the timer for 30 minutes, and maybe you go back to the same project, or maybe you're doing a different project. But the idea is that for that 30 minutes, I am not going to interrupt what I am doing. And again, this is a book designed for people working in offices. So it talks about turning off your phone, but that works very well for us as well. Turning off your phone, your Facebook Messenger, all those kinds of things. Depending where you're writing, maybe putting on headphones so people don't interrupt you. Certainly, I know if some of you are writing with kids in the house, whether or not you have a sign that is like, when the sign is out, do not bother me. And particularly if you're doing that in short bursts, so like that sign will be up for 30 minutes and then I take it off, means that at that time, that's when you can come and ask me something. And if you interrupt me in the 30 minutes, it means because something is on fire, someone is bleeding, something serious is an emergency, that will do it. And yes, Kristen, that is exactly the Pomodoro method is basically the exact same thing. I've seen it referred to both ways. The Pomodoro is like a particular person who's talking about doing it in those kind of block chunks. If you don't have an office door, so if you are someone that is working at a kitchen table or those kinds of things, you can also look at what's happening. I think people saw, hang on, I'll get it. Again, I was talking to Mary Robinette, and we were talking about writing, and she talked about the fact that her husband would interrupt her. And so like, question, like, did you want potatoes with dinner? Like, And she, you know, like even if it's just a second where you look up and you're like, yeah, that sounds great. And then you look like just for a second, you have lost that flow. So she has a writing tiara of which she then gifted one to me. So the idea is if you have the tiara on, that means don't ask me anything again, unless the house is on fire, unless something is happening. So having some kind of visual cue to children or spouses or roommates that says, when this is going on, then this is all I am doing. I'm curious if anyone here writes with dictation. I have not done this. I am intrigued to try it out. It's probably not going to happen right away. Oh, Vig, you do.
Not really dictation. I do that a little bit, but the typos are just really annoying. So I write into voice memos. So instead of sitting down writing, I walk up and down my living room floor and I talk it all in, and then afterwards I will listen back and then write it.
Okay. Because one of the things this fellow who was talking about in this book is, of course, that we're all constrained by typing speed. So let's assume that you're a really great typist and you're doing something like 100 to 120 words per minute. That's pretty dang good. Most of us are probably not that great. Most of us are probably more around 75 to 80 words per minute. And some people maybe even slower. Particularly some people do struggle with carpal tunnel and various things in terms of if you are spending a lot of time on the computer. So he started using Dragon, which is one of the more common voice to speech. And of course, you can speak somewhere between 140 and 165 words per minute. So you're talking where once you have that thing trained, you can do it. And again, because you're doing the voice activated dictation model, his theory is it's much harder to get stuck in trying to fix everything. Like you just get it all out. No, you know, as Viggo's pointing out, there's going to be 1,000,001 typos because it's going to hear you say fuck and put in duck. And so there'll be all those lovely things that happen with any kind of that kind of thing. But it does give you the option of sort of maybe getting it out. And I'm curious, I'm going to give it a shot for myself because I'm curious to see how that works and if I find it frees up that way of doing it. I think a lot of you have been in Crystal's office hours where she's talked about how she does her writing, which is she writes on her phone. So she has an external keyboard, like she's not doing this. She has an external keyboard. Otherwise she'd have like huge wrists, like huge bulky like man wrists. So she uses an external keyboard. But for her, what she finds is because she can only see this tiny part of the screen, she doesn't catch herself and go back and try and fix things. She just keeps going. And I think, again, when you're trying to look at getting a lot of word count out and increasing your word count, that is something that might be worth a try. So I will report back, and I'm curious if anyone else gives it a go, if you find that works. Now, I have used what Vika was talking about in terms of making voice memos if you tend to come up with brilliant ideas or you're thinking aloud. People who have long commutes. I used to, when I was going down to my day job every day during rush hour over Ironworkers Bridge, meant I had a lot of time in the car. And I'd often be thinking about my story, and I would do a similar thing where I would turn on my phone and be like, well, what if the character Kim did this, and then sometimes I might even have a few lines of dialogue. And then again, later I could go back and play it and I'd find there was some really good material in there. Again, there is a fair bit of brain research that talks about the fact that when you're moving, your brain works in a different way. So that's why they'll often say, if you're finding that you're feeling stuck with a project, get up and do some movement. I know we're writers, so we're not necessarily people who want to get off our butt occasionally, but it does a lot of good. So there's a lot of research that says some kind of physical activity will do you a lot of good, whether that's hitting the gym, taking the dogs for a walk, but doing something where you're getting up and moving, but having some way of, if genius strikes when you're walking the dogs, that you can get that down is good. I used to have the theory that if it's really good, I'll remember it. That is in fact not true. Or I guess I should say, I don't know if it's true because I don't remember it, and then I have no way of having that back. But I don't think, from what I have read research-wise, that that's necessarily borne out by research. The truth of the matter is, if it's a great idea and it slips your mind, it can just be gone again. So having some way to write that down, whether that's you keep a notebook in your purse or in a pocket. A good friend of mine, he always carries a spiral notebook in his front pocket, and he just always has it, and has like one of those little tiny golf pencils. So, I mean, he's not going to be writing chapters, but if he's out and about and something occurs to him, he scribbles it down. We're now all carrying basically a computer in our pocket all the time if you have a phone. So there's really no excuse for either putting on voice memo or making yourself just a quick note. And if you haven't played with voice memos, it works pretty easily. But I am interested to try the dictation, where then it's actually even typed up as well. The other big takeaway from this book, so I'm saving you the time, you don't even have to read it if you're not inclined, is he talks about training yourself, which is the idea that you get faster by tracking that, in the same way that if you go to the gym and you're tracking how, what's the resistance on the bike and how long do you spend on the bike, then you can slowly be increasing that. So his point is that you should be tracking your word count. And he tracks two things, which is words per hour and then words per day. And he has broken it down into how many words per day versus like new words versus revising. So he has different algorithms, but he can kind of have a sense of where he's performing at. So I think that is an interesting thing. There is... Donna put a free word tracking spreadsheet for people that's in the Academy, so you can download that if you want, or you can go old school and scribble it in the notebook that you have, but some way of starting to track what you do. And I think the sprints, if people are participating in the sprints, is really interesting to sort of see, kind of day over day, how do you do? And how do you do, maybe looking at certain things that are on there, like, did you in fact, I don't know, turn off GLIP? I can't remember what day it was, but I think Donna was like, I see you people in GLIP, get out of there, you're actually in the sprint at the same time. So that will do it. Bonnie has the note, I don't know if people see it, that her brilliance occurs in the shower. And that is also not unusual. There is actually some interesting research, I don't know if you knew that the sound of water actually does sometimes do it. So I know some people who actually write with a sound machine of rain, because there is maybe, and again, some of this might just be wishful thinking and hoping and dreaming, but I'm okay with that. Like, if it actually gets words on the page, try it. So having some kind of maybe white noise or rain can do it. The idea, like Bonnie talked about, sort of scribbling it in the shower on the glass wall. Strangely enough, there is stuff that backs that up as well, that as we write things, we do things differently. So there have been a lot of studies that have looked at college kids who are taking classes, and so whether or not they're taking their own notes. So there are some programs now where they do, because kids are much more clever than we were. So some of them are doing Google Docs, right? So everyone will contribute notes to the class, and it's in one document, and then they all have it. Kids today, they don't walk uphill to school, and they don't take their own damn notes. But they're seeing, some professors are finding that the information isn't sticking as well. So the process of having to slow down and write it, and there also seems to be some things that indicate that handwriting it versus typing it also makes a difference. And when we stick people in MRIs and actually look at their brain when they do those things, because researchers love to do weird stuff, like stick them in an MRI, see what happens. It does light up different parts of the brain. So I know for myself, for a very long time, if I get stuck with writer's block, I turn off my laptop and I get out paper and pen, and I will go to a different location. So I will pick up and take myself someplace else, and I will handwrite. And that usually, for some reason, will shake something free. So that will work. So I wanted to do a check-in. How are people doing with their NaNo projects? Is it coming along? Is everyone doing NaNo? Jen's like, no.
Well, I'm kind of doing NaNo. I'm definitely a rebel. So I'm not, I didn't start a new project, but I'm sort of editing the piece that I've been working on because it needs to be done and I didn't want to take time away from it. And but I'm also doing prompts every day. So just to generate little starters for myself for the future. And I hadn't been doing that for a really long time. So it's nice to get back to it.
I rarely do like traditional NaNo. It just doesn't suit me. So, and in the other sense, in general, I usually do pretty well with just getting words on the page. So it's not necessarily something where I feel like I need to do NaNo in order to do that. But I do think there's something wonderful about that kind of sort of shared community of writers where everybody is sort of focusing and doing this thing. And, you know, you go onto social media and people are talking about their word count and those kinds of things. And that can work. A lot of people are a little tiny bit competitive. No, really, Bonnie, they are. So you will see people where, you know, if someone else is posting that thing, or if there is something to kind of work towards. And again, I keep going back to the gym examples, probably partly because my college roommate's staying with me and she's like the gym maven and amazing at it. And she very carefully tracks everything, right? So when you look at it, you can see that she's keeping track of what is she lifting and when did she go and how long was she there and how far did she run and at what speeds. And I think when we're not tracking that stuff, it's really easy to give ourselves credit for stuff that we have not maybe in fact done. It's hard to see the progress. So it's hard to be like, oh, I was at this and now I'm at this. And I think people tend to go one of two ways. So there are those of us who might give ourselves credit when credit is not due. And there are others where they're not giving themselves credit at all. And one of the things Crystal and I recently, in fact, had talked about was, you know, beating ourselves up for things that hadn't got checked off the to-do list. And then making a list of like, well, what did I do with the day? Because I wasn't, you know, sitting around eating bonbons, and realizing like, I actually got a lot done. It maybe wasn't what I had set out to do, but I did get a lot done. And if you're tracking that, like if you do get in the habit of writing that stuff down, then you can also go back and be like, am I spending my time where I said I wanted to? So stuff got done. And maybe it was a non-choice. Maybe those things had to get done that day. And life does have a way of doing that sometimes, particularly if you have small people around you or a day job that just doesn't seem to care about your creative genius for some reason. Then sometimes you can get derailed at the best of times, but tracking it will let you do that. And it will give you the sense of being further along. I don't know about other people, but for me, it's the 3/4 point when all hope is lost. And I become convinced that the story is crap. And I'm convinced that it's never going to get finished and all of those things. The only good news is that that happens every single time. So now I kind of expect it when it comes around. But keeping track of stuff and sort of seeing that I'm chipping away towards that word count, towards the finish line, does keep me going when it's been a long haul. All right, we're kind of coming close to the end. Any questions? Anything people wanted to share or talk about? Kristen's got an idea off the clock. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, she's written a series of books about, she did one that's called How Does She Do It? About how like CEOs, all these people seem to have these full lives, and lately felt like you did, like I'm doing all this stuff and I'm not doing, nothing's done, and where's my time going? And I'm this huge time deficit in my life. And her whole premise is everybody gets the same 180 minutes per week. So if you track it, then you know where it goes. And you can slow down time that way because you can spend it on what you want to spend it on instead of on what you don't want to spend time, like, you know, flicking through Netflix or whatever. So.
Hey, don't you be making fun of Netflix. So yeah, I do think it is very interesting when you start tracking time and word count, what you'll notice. So I am going to put these things into action, and I will give it a try. And I am going to try the dictation. I think Dragon has a Mac app that you can sort of try, and I'll be interested to give that a go. Bea, can you speak to time debt?
Yes, I'll keep my video off because it's nighttime over here and we have very bad connection. It's Linda Sivertson. She is writing a book with a fellow writer. She has a YouTube. If you go in and look in YouTube for Linda Sivertson Time Debt, it's a TEDx talk that she did, and she'll explain it all there. But it's very interesting. I think the book is coming out soon. I've been watching her, and she's definitely on the final draft, if not even at the editor's stage. So,
yeah, I think one of my goals for this year has been, and I have it written quite frequently in my book, is purposeful. So I'm just trying to make sure that when I spend time, I'm doing it purposefully, even if that is on quote unquote wasting time. So if my plan is to watch Netflix, and I am going to watch it, Kirsten, so there, that it is purposefully choosing to watch Netflix, that it is the idea of, this is a show that I really want to see, and I want to relax for the next hour or 2 hours and enjoy this show, or binge watch, a season of Game of Thrones, or walk the dog, or whatever it is that I'm doing, but that it's not just, and I think we've all gotten in that habit where all of a sudden you realize you've spent the last hour strolling through Facebook and you don't even care. Like, these aren't even people that you know, and you don't even like them that much, but you're just like, dinner, puppy, funny. And you're just sort of scrolling, and like an hour has gone by and nothing has happened. Or you realize that the TV is on and you're not even really like you couldn't even say what you had just watched, or you've actually watched Big Bang Theory and you know it so well because you've seen that same episode 17 times. So you actually could quote it if you were so inclined, and you don't even like that particular episode that much. It's not like it's your favorite episode of all time, where all of a sudden that's 30 minutes that's gone. So I think Kirsten's point about, everybody gets the same amount of time is a really valid one. And around that idea of, am I spending my time? And particularly I think with NaNo being going on right now, it's just a really good time to kind of pause and ask yourself, am I spending my time where I want to spend it? So speaking of that, I will be back this evening. So we are going to have office hours at 5, and I'm going to be tackling the topic of coincidences. So that's what I'll be talking about. So if anyone is around and wants to have that conversation, that would be lovely. Just to keep people in the loop, I am having surgery actually on Thursday. We should all be good, and I'm all that kind of stuff, but I am guessing for kind of Thursday, Friday, Saturday, I probably may not be on GLIP, or I shouldn't be answering questions on GLIP because I'll be high as a kite, which may mean you get really great answers or you get really lousy answers. Just so that if you're thinking like, oh, I asked Eileen a question, I haven't heard from her, that would be why. So I'm guessing on kind of 2 to 3 days where I'll be a little less around, but I am technically still around. So if people need me, let me know. All right. And on that, I'm going to send you all off on your own merry ways. Consider keep writing, all that kind of stuff. And thank you, Vic. I will do my part in surgery, and that I will sleep hopefully through the whole darn thing. So I want to thank everybody, and I will see you all this evening, hopefully. And if not, I will see you next Tuesday. Happy writing.
Good. Thanks, Eileen. Good luck.
Thank you.